For a couple of weeks in the summer of 1987, 18-year-old Matthias Rust was the most famous pilot in the world. On May 13th, Rust took off from Hamburg, West Germany, in a single-engine Cessna rented from his local flying club. He had only 50 hours of flight time and wanted to bulk up on his experience. He spent the next 2 weeks traveling across Northern Europe, first to Denmark's Faroe Islands and later to Iceland. On May 28th, in Helsinki, Finland, he filed a flight plan to Stockholm, Sweden, and took off shortly after midday. But no sooner had he reached his cruising altitude than Finnish air traffic controllers showed him veering 180 degrees off course, heading south rather than north, directly into a busy aviation corridor over the Gulf of Finland. They tried to contact Rust, but could not raise him. Soon, he vanished from radar, and emergency crews were dispatched, believing he'd crashed. They found nothing but an oil slick. But Rust hadn't crashed, nor had he set out on his new course by accident. The teenager had grown up in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, and recent talks between the US and the Soviet Union regarding nuclear disarmament had failed. Rust decided he needed to make a statement that the entire world could understand. He wanted to build, in his words, an imaginary bridge from the west to the east, an attempt to warm the increasingly chilly Cold War. With him on the plane was a 20-page manifesto for world peace that he intended to hand-deliver to Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, air traffic controllers finally began picking up Rust's small Cessna. But these weren't Finnish air traffic controllers. They were members of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. Rust was heading straight toward Moscow. All attempts to contact him failed, and the plane was listed as a potential threat. Surface-to-air missile batteries locked onto the aircraft, and fighter jets were scrambled to intercept him. But in a comedy of errors, Rust was incorrectly identified as part of the search and rescue exercise and ignored. Rust was very lucky. Just 4 years earlier, the Soviet Air Force blew a Korean Airlines passenger jet out of the sky after it inadvertently strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard. Around 7 p.m. that evening, Rust's tiny Cessna appeared over Moscow, the most heavily defended city on the planet. Thanks to auxiliary fuel tanks inside the plane, Rust had flown 550 miles to reach the capital of the Soviet Union. Rust's plan was to land his plane in the middle of Red Square, but there were too many people milling about. So he touched down on the Bolshoi Moskvoretsky Bridge next to Red Square and parked his plane beside St. Basil's Cathedral and Lenin's tomb. He was soon mobbed by curious onlookers who wanted autographs. When he said he was from Germany, they assumed he meant East Germany and were astonished when he told them he was actually from the West. Not surprisingly, 2 truckloads of soldiers soon appeared, and Rust was carted off by the KGB. The Soviets could not believe the young man pulled off such an audacious feat alone. Many suspected he was part of a far larger CIA-orchestrated plot. Rust was sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp, but spent just 14 months in prison before being released as part of a goodwill gesture after Gorbachev and U.S. President Ronald Reagan signed a treaty eliminating intermediate-range nukes in Europe. The reputation of the Soviet military and Russia's supposedly impenetrable airspace was shattered. Gorbachev, who was desperate to make the sort of reforms that, just a few years later, would herald the end of the USSR, used Rust's stunt as an excuse to fire hundreds of officers who opposed his policies, the largest turnover in the Soviet military since Stalin's infamous purges half a century earlier. Rust returned to Germany and never piloted an airplane again. Stay curious, my friends.